So everybody, let's get started for the very last module. As I said, it will be a rather short one. It's also set intentionally that we spend most of the time today with workflows, because workflows are the ins and outs, and once you get the grip of it, it will really simplify a lot of your life, particularly a lot of the tasks that are repetitive. I saw also a lot of your students, if you do working student jobs, you can have so much more free time when you are able to use some of these automation tools quite properly. Let's talk about data. So in our framework, where does data come in? Data comes in at the very back end of everything. It is where every logic step talks to, where everything is stored, where everything gains permanence. And we have discussed that there are a lot of considerations we should have with data. And what you already saw with Make is that there are so many different sources where you can use data. We try to work with internal data stores. We worked with Google Sheets, which is another spreadsheet, very similar to Excel. And now we want to focus a little bit on Airtable. One best practice that you did not see now in the workflow optimization is, Jana, you showed this huge workflow where you had 1 million steps from the beginning to the end. One best practice is not to do that way. What you want is to feed some data to a data store, and every step of data processing should basically be between data store and data store. So when you have a huge workflow and something breaks in this one scenario that you're building, you basically waste the entire pre-processing that has been done and maybe don't even know where the problem happened, which can create problems once your workflows become more complicated. Easier and easier to manage is to get some data, put it in a data store, then run ChatGPT on it, put it back in the data store, then do some manipulations, put it back in the data source, then serve it from the data store to the customer. This way, also adding features is way easier. Changing GPT models is way easier, because you know that everything is basically a microscopic service, a microservice, so to say. It's not really a microservice, obviously, but it's way more granular and way easier to manage. Let's think about Airtable. Let's talk about Airtable quite a bit. Once you open Airtable, it's a very familiar view. It looks very much like a spreadsheet. The only difference, it's not a spreadsheet. It can do things that a spreadsheet can't, and it can't do things a spreadsheet can. For example, you can't calculate in a table as easily as you can in a spreadsheet. In Airtable, every single row has the format of being a data point. So you can't do formatting there. You can't leave some things empty. You can't just write in function somewhere and draw your data from somewhere. This is what you can do in a spreadsheet, and this is why we all love spreadsheets or hate them for that reason. On the other hand, what you can do in Airtable is you can connect your data to each other way better, and you can create data persistency way better. But I'll show you on a practical example in a second. What do we have? It's a database. It's not an Excel sheet. It's not a spreadsheet. We've discussed this in depth. The way it works, every database is called a base. And in this base, there lives a bunch of tables. So every table in the spreadsheet analogon that we know would be like the sheets. So you can refer from every base to every other base. The idea is that every base is for one specific kind of data. For example, this example that I will show you in a minute, and that we're talking about the web shop. One table could be my customers, another could be my products, the third one could be my orders to fulfill. So this is how you would think about tables. So you can, of course, connect all of these, but customers should live in their own table and orders in their other table. Another thing that's a little bit was a little bit confusing to me at the beginning is that you have different views. Views is nothing that you happen to have in classical databases. But Airtable is a very graphical database, very visual database, so you have the opportunity to create different views. You can view everything like a field. If you're familiar to Notion, then you're also familiar to this concept. You can, for example, very famously put the Kanban to this and work in a Kanban in your database if you want to order, for example, for are the orders fulfilled. It also gives you a little bit more than just the data. It gives you some work automatization, which we will show in a second, and it also gives you interfaces. We only want to talk about interfaces tomorrow, but however, if you're building an internal tool, it can build internal interfaces which might be helpful. For example, we built an ERP based on Airtable, which does, for example, all the production planning. Since we are only using this internally, this interface builder, which is somewhat limited and somewhat rigid, does it good enough to solve the problems that we have right here. The point I want to bring across is when you're building a product or a prototype, then this interface builder is something you can probably go the first couple of meters, but very early you will grow out this interface builder. It only shows data. It does not process data. It does nothing with the data, but only shows it as it is. And then you also have logic. The logic inside Airtable is very, very limited. You can do some things that are a little bit cool, like receiving webhooks. We'll talk about webhooks in depth tomorrow. But don't think that you can use this as a logic layer as you could do a full-fledged system like Make or Zapier. This has no connections to a lot of other tools. This has connections, I think, to Google. This has connections to Slack, but that's more or less it. So if you want to send data to, let's say, ChatGPT, if you want to send data to Buffer, to whatever system you can imagine, you can't do this here. So this logic interface is something I also use very, very infrequent. And it also gives me reason to talk about limitations of low-code. So as I was saying in the beginning, every low-code system is restricted by the intentions they were set up by the developers. So, of course, also is Airtable. And Airtable is a relational database, so you make relations from one table to another table, but even in that it's more restricted than, for example, a Postgres database that you might be familiar to use with. One thing we try to build, or that we do build, is this ERP app. So we wanted to build a recipe app for an iPad. So in our production, we just have the iPad where the employees can see what to produce on that specific date, the recipes, and work through the recipes basically step by step. It should be, from the data perspective, be a rather simple thing to do. So, scenario as described to you. So what do we need? We, of course, need to store the recipes. We need to plan the production for specific days. That's basically a management task. And we need to show the planned recipe on each day in the production facility on an iPad that the employee can move around. So the solution seems easy enough. Create an Airtable for all the recipes, drag and drop the recipes into days, create a view for each day, and show the recipes one at a time on the iPad. This is where everything got insanely complicated. Recipes are a specific form of data because you know that for recipe A needs an unspecified amount of different ingredients, and for this unspecified amount of ingredients, we need an unspecified measure of it could be grams, it could be a volume. So Airtable cannot work with unspecified data like that. How would you do this in a Postgres SQL? You would nest the data into a data field. Airtable doesn't support nesting data. Sounds like I'm complaining on a very high level, but nesting data is a very, very foundational concept if you want to work with data. So every data needs to be specific in Airtable, and you need to find your way to do that and to find workarounds to do that. You will find workarounds for almost everything in almost every low-code tool. but it can be somewhat of an annoyance. And the second thing that didn't work, Airtable has a web app and a desktop app and an iPhone app, but not an iPad app. So we are now thinking of either buying a very, very big phone that almost is an iPad or a tablet, or putting a computer in the production, which of course does not make too much sense because there are a lot of liquids going around. Meaning we have a lot of limitations. We managed to solve those, but it still means you need to think a lot on how to get past these problems. The last thing that I wanted to talk in theory about is don't get high on your own supply, which is particularly true for data. There is a vendor login. Whatever tool you're using, if it's Make, if it's Airtable, you will be specifically hooked on this particular tool. And if you saw that it has limitations that at some point you probably don't want to live with, and on the other hand, probably costs you quite a lot, it's quite hard to get away from this. Why am I showing this with Airtable? Imagine your business completely depends on Airtable. All your customer data is in Airtable. All your product data is in Airtable. All the connections, which customer is using what product at what time, is in Airtable. Then of course that's a super strong point for Airtable, which is a nice company, but that doesn't need to stay for infinity, right? And the only thing you can do is you can download every single table as a CSV. That is super problematic because you don't download the keys as well, and you don't download the relations to this as well, which means at some point if you need to switch from Airtable because it's too expensive or it doesn't scale anymore or it has shortcomings that you can't work with, you will have a very long transition period. So always think about when you build something on a low-code tool, like when you build something on every tool, how do you get away from this tool again? Let me give you a very quick practical example on how Airtable works, which you don't see, which now you do see. So this is the front end of Airtable. Once you open it, you are greeted with this kind of yes, I do have internet. This kind of front end. And one thing, a simple thing I did for you is I already created a base. You can see here with create, you can always create a new base. And I did this here for the example shop that we are building this morning. And once this loads, loading the views actually in Airtable is a little bit slow at times. Working with the data accessibility on the through the API is usually quite good. Let's try this again. And let's see what could be the problem. There we go. And what you see, what I've built here, also make this bigger for you, is I have created three tables. One is orders, the second one is customer, the third one is products. What is the cool thing now about the low code? If we, for example, work with customers, then I have one customer who has, of course, a name, of course, an email, and here you see that we have orders that are connected to this. So, for example, me as a customer with Basti at example, or let's take a real email that I have. This is now a set customer, and I can say that I have made an order, and I have bought, what were we selling? Pet pandas. I can remember we had pet pandas. Let's put this. It's a pet panda. That should be description enough. Oh, I'm so sorry that I did not mean to do that. So in the orders now, I can say Basti just ordered a pet panda. Fantastic. And the cool thing, you see this are now relational data. So in customers, we see that I ordered the order number 1. And in products, we can see the order number 1 is pet panda is included in the order number 1. which is super helpful when we want to make analyses, when we want to see, when we want to change products, when we want to work with products, and everything is already updated through the entire database. This is the power of a relational database. Everybody of you who has worked with that, of course, is aware. The other great thing about Airtable is now then we have this customer, and at some point we say, okay, we want to have more data, we can just manipulate the data scheme. Make is not very happy with that because it tends to break all your automations, but if you have considered that you want to change your automation and your data scheme, you can just do this as easy as that. So for example, we need my phone number as well, and we just do that. I think we need to make it a number, and there we go, we just added it. Wonderful. So this is one thing that is very easy to use with that. If you have worked with a SQL database, you know this is a little bit more complicated to get the data structure the way you want it to be. And this is why we, again, in prototyping, we can just play around with it until we are good to go, until we think, now is the way, now we know exactly what we need. This is exactly how a base for customers needs to look like. Now we can build it in higher code. And the last thing I wanted to show you is now here we have the orders. For example, for every status, we can also set a default field, which can be super helpful. For example, to do. So the pet panda I already ordered is, of course, still in to do. Then we can add a Kanban field to it. Whoops, no. Go back. We can add a Kanban to it, sort by state, and now we can say, okay, this is something we now can work with and say, okay, we have one thing to fulfill. Somebody has to get a pet panda to Basti. Now it's one. This is obviously not very helpful, but we, for example, can also add, so let's put this in progress. I will get him one after this, thing. So we can see, okay, here's a pet panda included, and now say in the Kanban, okay, which products are included. This name should be changed to products. Actually, I'm a little bit slow on how to do this right now. I don't want to bore you, but I think you see the how the system works, how the system is supposed to work. This is now everything we can do. Of course, we can do the same, and particularly if we want to work with a Kanban field like this, it does make more sense to, so for products, for example, we could put in a gallery as well, so everybody can see the product in a little bit easier to digest way. If we actually want to have a fulfillment interface with that, that would be something where we can use the interfaces quite quickly. Just put an interface, please just do it, okay? With the Kanban, and we can then share that with our coworkers and say, okay, these are the orders now. The advancement, the advantage doing this in the interface rather than in the data is here you can restrict what data can be altered. So here in the data, I could by accident add something to the order that hasn't been there. In the interface, I could restrict that, for example. So this would be the advantage of putting something in an interface rather than in the data. Again, now we're jumping very much from this framework from thinking about data to thinking about interface. Of course, the interface and the data should be separated through, for example, these interfaces that Airtable offers you, so you can't, by accident, do something in the data that you wouldn't want to do. Fantastically, let's go back. Situation when you want to get rid of the vendor login, and then you would use something like Supabase. So you just would move or copy the bases that you have from Airtable to an SQL database. Supabase is basically a visual front end to whatever database you want to use. I'm a big fan. What you already see, of course, is that it needs a little bit more technical expertise to know what you're doing here. So this is why you probably wouldn't start with it, but you would probably at some point want to go in this direction. And it gives you just so many options to set every single database exactly what you need. We were discussing this morning how do we store vectors, or are vectors hot or cold data. You could store vectors in that. You of course can't store vectors in Airtable. However, when you're building a chatbot, for the first 20 or so users, it probably doesn't make too much of a difference if you store the output of GPT in an SQL, in a text form. Of course, at some point, you probably want to store intermediate output in a vector database. For this, you can move up like this. If you want to learn more about this, I've also built a learning to code virtual microclass online on T12S. It's in very early alpha. If you want to help me making this better, then I'm also very, very grateful for you. Also, a lot of things that we have discussed that are coming up on the AI Creators Microclass. We also already had an AI Microclass last month, and a lot of the things that Jana was showing with how to do the prompt engineering, which was already quite advanced prompt engineering stuff, you might remember we covered in the microclass on prompt engineering. Everything is online. As I promised, this would only be a very short segment, so please, again, I need your input.